Okay, taste rolling. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hollis, can you tell us about your role in the civil rights movement?
As a part of the civil rights movement, at different points in times, I had different roles. My first role in the civil rights movement had to do with me passing out flyers and talking with community people, inviting them to come to the meetings. I later had a role in trying to convince people to go down and register to vote. I also had a role to look at all of the places that were segregated and motivate and inspire young people to be willing to have sit-in demonstrations and go and have sit-in demonstrations as a part of that. My role also was to help raise funds for the organizations to get people out of jail. My role also had to do with me teaching people how to fill out the literacy test, which they had to take when they went and attempted to register. My role also was to make sure that I communicated with people and give them an understanding as to why they should be a part of the movement. And my role also in the civil rights movement had to do with me helping to train the summer volunteers that was coming down to Mississippi for the summer of 1964, and to make sure that they understood the mission, why they came, and to help see that they were all guided in the right direction and were provided the necessary protection as best as we could to make sure that they were safe. So those are some of the roles that I had as a part of the civil rights movement.
Okay. In your opinion, what were the most important things that the movement accomplished?
To me, one of the most important things that the movement accomplished was to inspire and motivate large numbers of young people to accept and acknowledge the fact that tremendous changes needed to be made, and inspired those young people to play an active role in bringing those changes about.
What work remains unfinished?
Racism is still alive and well in Mississippi and throughout this country, just as it was in the late 50s and early 60s. Racism is still alive and well, so that is work that is unfinished. When we look at those that are dominating and controlling things in this country, we see to a great extent it is still in the hands of those that it was in the hands of then, or their descendants, and in most cases their descendants is carrying on and carrying out the same policies, sometimes executed in a different way that their parent and their foreparent carried on. So we have unfinished business to make sure that justice, which stands afar off, is something that eventually prevails in this country. And when I say justice, I'm talking about a system of fair dealings with one another. We are a long ways off from having such a system.
Why did you help create the Veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement?
One of the reasons that I participated in helping to create the Veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement organization is because there were a number of veterans that were still around who seemed to be just going and not doing things in a unified method. And I'm knowing that where there's unity, there's strength. So I wanted to create a method, a process by which we could bring veterans together, where they could feel and know that there was a sense of unity that still existed between us who was a little bit older now, who were very young during the late 50s and early 60s. Also, I wanted to do that because I knew that many people was writing about us and were not getting the story accurate. And I wanted to make sure that we had an organization of our own that could record directly from the people who made the history and them telling their own story, so that we could preserve the true history and the true stories that people lived through.
Okay. And in addition to those stories that you're collecting and documenting, what other things does the Veterans Organization have to offer activists and organizers today?
Veterans today can give activists and organizers a reservoir, a large reservoir of wealth, information as it relates to how you do organizing, how you do mobilizing, the difference between organizing and mobilizing. One of the problems that we are still facing today is disunity. Disunity can be overcome through a process of organizing. So we can teach younger people how we organized, how we mobilized, and some of us can share 50 years of practical experience with young people today. Being able to share years of practical experience can and will help young people not make many of the mistakes that we made when we were out there and we had no serious foundation that was real broad that we could stand on, that we could learn from people who were right there in the communities, right there in the states. But today, veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement can offer that. It is too often that we don't have a history of our past, and because of not having a true history of our past, we have the wrong understanding of where we are, and therefore not knowing where we are, where we came from. It makes it very difficult for us to talk about where it is that we need to go, let alone develop an effective strategy and a meaningful program of work that gets us there.
Was the Civil Rights Movement really a human rights movement?
As I see it retrospectively, the Civil Rights Movement really was a human rights movement. Those of us that were active initially in what is called the Civil Rights Movement, we didn't decide that that was the name of our movement. We were in debates and discussions as to whether we should call our movement a civil rights movement or a human rights movement. But the media grabbed it and ran with it and started projecting it as a civil rights movement. So not having the time and the resource to adequately combat that, and not having made a collective final decision on it, the civil rights movement prevailed in that whole effort. But I think those that we were fighting against wanted to make sure that it was postured as a civil rights movement, therefore usurping some of our strength just through the name, knowing that a human rights organization or human rights movement has greater latitude than those that are called and defined as civil rights. And I think that was an effort to usurp some of our strength, to make sure that we were not able to use the strength that the human rights movement would have given us, the level by which we could have gone, therefore making it much more difficult for those who were dominating and controlling, who was not about the willingness to give up any of that domination or any of that control.
Do you think we need a human rights movement today?
When we look at humans today, we see that humans are not being treated as human. Humans are being treated in many areas, in many ways, as animals. And because of that, a human rights movement is desperately needed, because when a person is made to believe or don't see themselves first as a human, then they see it consciously and subconsciously as something else. So we need a human rights movement so that we can reinstill the dignity, the pride that we once had years ago in ourselves, in one another. And when we can see it in ourselves, we can also see it in one another. And when you can see it in someone else other than yourselves, then that within itself creates a certain kind of bonding. It lays the foundation for people to come together to build a solid wall, a solid movement that will go further into the future than we can even imagine or think about at this particular time.
Do we need systemic change in this country?
I would say we definitely need systemic change in this country. And if that change does not come about, then we need a whole new. Some things can be dealt with through change. Some things have to be done away with and replaced. I would say we need systemic change so that we can begin to see each other as human beings. We can begin to look at things from a system perspective rather than an issue perspective. Too often we get stuck and hung up on specific issues. And once you're dealing with issues, because of there being so many issues, then you become isolated. And you find yourself working in a small corner. And it's hard for you when you're so sold on specific issues, it's hard for you to see the big picture. And if we don't see the big picture, then that means we will be fighting forever, not realizing how my specific issue is connected to your specific issue and how your specific issue as well as mine is connected to others. So we need systemic change so that we can institute and bring about new systems, new methods, new processes by which things are dealt with. And in order for us to have the changes that need to be made, that's how we're going to have to begin to look at things. It's changing system through systemic change rather than us looking at isolated issues. And when you look at isolated issues, it also forces you or causes you to gravitate towards isolated events.
Speaking of changing systems, do you think our government is accountable to its people?
Our government, as I see it, definitely is not accountable to the masses of its people. Our government, as far as I see it, is accountable to those who are, quote unquote, in power, those who have money. And as people used to say in the South, money talks and everything else walks. But our government sees and knows, and I say our government, so I'm really talking about those that are in positions in our government. They are afraid of the systems, the people who financed and aided them to get in the positions that they're in. And as a result of that, they're accountable to those few. And when I say accountable, I'm talking about putting community interests above self-interest, which our government has not arrived at that point yet. Our government is still focused in dealing with the minority, the very minority. And when I say minority, I'm not talking about people of color. I'm talking about those who are in political power, those who have money, those who are backing those that are in political power. So many of our people who start out being good people, they fall into the corrupt system. And as of now, based on how things are, they either have to go along with the system or the system kicks them out. So that's why we need to become more organized. We need to become more educated, more informed, so we can analyze this what we have in a very, very critical way and see if there's any hope that it can be revised and survive, or whether we need to look at a whole new system instead of it.
Would a successful Human Rights at Home campaign change that?
Would a successful human rights campaign at home change that? I know it would change it to a great extent. Whether it would change it completely depends on the success of it. So if we say, would a successful one change it, then I would have to say yes, because a successful human rights campaign, I see it starting, as some folks say, at the grassroots level, building a solid foundation there by which it expands and goes beyond that. And over a period of time, building on that which we start at the grassroots level in the local communities, spreading on out to the broader communities and the counties and eventually the states and then the nation as a whole, and ultimately the whole world, where we could have a world where peace and tranquility was the order of the day, rather than bigotry, hate, discrimination, and racism. So I think it can be done. It just will take time.
Have you gotten any information on the Human Rights at Home campaign? They give you some, did they talk to you about it?
Very little.
Okay, because the next question is, what do you think of the Human Rights at Home campaign?
What do I think of the Human Rights at Home campaign? Having been reared the way I was reared, charity starts at home. So a human rights campaign at home to me means that we start exactly where we are. And to me, I think that's the way it needs to be. It's too often we in this country look at and talk about human rights elsewhere abroad, and we're doing this in the name of peace for other people, where when we look at ourselves right here, we're suffering from the same thing. So I support and believe that a human rights campaign here at home is how to start it, is how it needs to be. And as we grow, then we can afford to show a model to people as we expand. Right now, we don't have a decent model that we can show to others in terms of human rights campaign. anything else unless it's about how to be the biggest bully. So, to me, I'm all in support of human rights campaign right here at home. And I'd like for all of us on a statewide basis to look at starting one at home, networking, coordinating with others in other areas where that we see that we are not isolated, but we see that our brothers and sisters in other areas of the state, other areas of the country is talking about doing the same thing, and we communicate, network with each other, so that as we all go down our different paths, we will see and realize that there are intersections that take place, and when we meet at those intersections, we make a joyful and giant noise, because when we come together in total unity, our unity is more powerful than an atom bomb. And that's why our enemies want to make sure we do not come together and unite. But I think it can be done with the campaign, human rights campaign, starting right at home.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.